Okay, so today's talk is on the topic of externalities. Just to quickly outline some of the core objectives of this lecture, we're going to be defining what it means to be an external cost and external benefits, and address the efficiency implications of external costs and external benefits. In particular, how the presence of these in the marketplace lead to deadweight loss. And then we're going to talk about some of the solutions of this so-called externality problem. And we'll address two broad types of solutions. There are market-based solutions, particularly what we refer to as the Coase theorem. And there are several government-based solutions that we'll quickly review, in particular, corrective taxes and corrective subsidies, command and control policies, and then if we've got time, I'll briefly look into cap and trade as a potential option, which is a hybrid between command and control and market-based solutions, such as the Coase theorem. In a standard market situation, it's important to remember that the height of the demand curve measures the benefit on the margin of consuming some sort of commodity, whereas the height of the supply curve measures the opportunity cost at the margin of bringing any sort of commodity to market. And for most goods, and really up to this point in our lecture, we've been thinking of the supply curve and demand curves as really capturing all of the costs and all of the benefits of a market transaction. So, think about something, some sort of very, very innocuous commodity, such as of a book. Now, when supply curves and demand curves measure the full costs and benefits of a transaction, we get the very, very traditional market outcome where supply and demand intersect at some sort of equilibrium price and quantity, and consumer surplus and producer surplus are maximized, meaning there's no real deadweight loss in the economy. And resources are allocated in a way that the highest value uses and the lowest cost uses of resources also prevail. So we get something that looks kind of like this, which is really what we've been seeing up to this point. Okay, when we're talking about all the costs or all the benefits, we're really talking about social costs and social benefits. Okay, and we can really easily break down social costs and social benefits into both a private and an external component. Now, private benefits and private costs are those benefits and costs that are realized by the private decision maker, the person who's actually making the decision to consume something or produce something. The private costs and private benefits of producing and consuming books are just those costs and benefits that are realized by the sellers and purchasers of books. But there oftentimes can be an external component, which I'll abbreviate as EC for external costs, and EB as external benefits. And these are costs and benefits that are realized in society, but not by the private decision makers. So in the book case that I just gave, there's probably not a lot of external cost or external benefit being realized. But think of a different type of transaction, maybe the producing and consumption of cigarettes. The costs to the smoker being the adverse health effects, in addition to the monetary. But there are clearly external costs, in particular those that flow to secondhand smokers. These are players in the economy that have no say a decision to smoke or to consume cigarettes, and yet they bear some of the costs. Or conversely, on the benefit side, we can think of a transaction where I decide to paint my house. And when I paint my house, the full social benefits of that transaction are not just my private benefits. Because yes, when I paint my house, I get a feeling of satisfaction. My house now looks nicer. That's why I did it. But my neighbors, who really have no say in whether or not I actually paint my house, also benefit. Okay, and those benefits that they realize are external benefits, and their benefits plus my benefits, when added together, that's the full social benefit of that decision to paint my house. The exact same way that the full social cost of smoking cigarettes should account not only for the costs of the private decision maker, but the costs that are realized by non-decision makers, in particular secondhand smokers. Okay. Now, as a group, these external costs and external benefits are referred to as externalities. Externalities that are produced on the consumption side, we oftentimes refer to as consumption externalities. So my consumption of cigarettes creates an external cost to those who are breathing in my secondhand smoke. Or we also have production externalities, where it's actually the production of something that creates the externalities. So we can think of the production of steel, if it's a very dirty, polluting process, creates external costs to those who have to breathe in that polluted air or who have to deal with that polluted water. There, it's not so much the consumption of steel that creates externality, it's the production of steel. Oftentimes you'll hear external costs being referred to as negative externalities because they're costs, so they're negative, they kind of harm society. And oftentimes you'll hear external benefits as being referred to as positive externalities because they're good for society, so we call them positive externalities. For our purposes in this class, we'll just be referring to external costs and external benefits, not making any distinction between consumption externalities or production externalities or negative externalities or positive externalities. Now, what makes externalities interesting and what gives rise to the potential for market failure is that private agents, those who are actually in charge of making economic decisions, buyers and sellers, rarely fully account for costs and benefits that they impose on others. Okay? When I make the decision to get a flu shot, I'm weighing my own private benefits and my own private costs. When I'm making the decision to smoke a cigarette, I'm weighing my own private benefits and my own private costs. I don't account for the external costs or external benefits that others realize. Even though if we're interested in maximizing society's welfare, if we want to maximize society's surplus, then we should really look at not only the private consumer surplus and the private producer surplus, we should also account for the surplus that gets generated for everyone else. And the way that we can kind of think about how this plays out is let's just kind of reinterpret the market supply curve and the market demand curve as really being the private supply curve and the private demand curve, because that's really what market prices reflect, are the costs and benefits to those decision makers who are actually engaged in making the private transaction. So here I'm just going to label the supply curve as SPVT. Okay, so this is the private supply curve. And I'm going to label the demand curve as DPVT. Okay, and market outcomes, the market clearing price and the market equilibrium quantity, will be denoted as PM and QM. Let's assume that we're talking about cigarettes. Okay, where we're going to make life easy by assuming that cigarettes don't really create much of an external benefit. So, the benefits that smokers receive when consuming cigarettes, all of that really only flows to the smoker himself and no one else. Which means that the social benefit is really equivalent to the private benefit. Remember, conversely, we're going to assume that there's an external cost, abbreviated as EC, that is positive, which means that the private costs, measured by the height of the private supply curve, is less than the true social cost, because there's this external cost, this external spillover, and that vertical distance is the external cost. Now, what this means is that in the market equilibrium, when private decision makers produce up to the point where the private benefits are equal to the private costs, we see that, all right, so what this means is that if we now account for the external costs that others incur, which means that if we were really interested not in maximizing a private decision maker's welfare, but maximizing society's welfare, we wouldn't buy and sell up to QM. We would buy and sell up to the point where the social demand curve is equal to the social supply curve, which is going to be at QS and PS. So the presence of externalities actually leads to too many cigarettes being smoked. Okay. The market outcome, QM, is to the right of the socially optimal outcome, QS, which means that there's some deadweight loss being produced in the economy. For each of these cigarettes being smoked, bought and sold, consumed in between QS and QM, the cost to society, the height of the supply curve, exceeds the benefits to society, the height of the demand curve. So this gray shaded triangle measures the deadweight loss for each of those cigarettes bought and sold beyond the socially optimal quantity. Okay, so we've got what we call a market failure. Let's take this from the perspective of an external benefit. Example of someone's a decision to mow her lawn. If I mow my front and backyard, it doesn't really generate any external cost. So let's ignore noise pollution and the pollution that gas-powered lawnmower might produce. Let's assume that those are nil. Okay, so let's assume that the external costs of mowing one's yard are relatively small, in fact zero. So that the supply curve for society is equivalent to the private supply curve. Okay? The cost that I incur for my yard, that's the cost of time, the cost of the gasoline, the cost of buying the lawnmower, all of that, those are really the only costs that really anyone incurs. So my costs are the cost to society. Now, that said, my private demand curve, right? The benefits that I incur from having a nice, well-kept yard are not necessarily the full social benefits of this decision to mow my yard, because my neighbors also benefit when I have a well-kept yard. They look outside their window. They walk past the sidewalk, on the way to their house, and they notice this really, really nice, well-kept yard. It puts a smile on their face, makes their property look nicer, so there's an external benefit that gets realized over and above my private benefit. So what's going on here? Well, now we see that the social demand curve actually exceeds the private benefits. So even though a private decision maker, weighing his own costs and benefits, will stop mowing yards at this point right here, QM, and that's at a market price of PM. If he was interested in mowing yards at a socially optimal level, then he would mow up to QS, mow a couple more times, and the price that would get us there in the market would be a little bit higher as well. Okay, anything that generates external benefits, we're going to have too few of, because private decision makers don't really account for those benefits when making a decision. So for all those quantities in between the optimal market quantity and the socially optimal quantity, so each one of those transactions has a social benefit that exceeds the social cost. So we actually produce too few, which means that we leave benefits social surplus on the table. Okay, and there's also deadweight loss to society that's realized as a result. The solutions to the externality problem are numerous. All of these solutions require that somehow private decision makers be forced to fully internalize the external costs and the external benefits of their decisions. Meaning that the full social cost and the full social benefit of one's actions are 100% realized by that decision maker. Okay? If that can be done, then private decision makers will act as if, and then they'll act accordingly by buying and selling up to a point where social surplus has been maximized. The first is the market-based solution, which is the Coase theorem. Now, the Coase theorem just stipulates that, well, markets can solve this externality problem relatively well if A, property rights are clearly defined and enforced, and B, if transactions costs are low. If A and B are both met, then individual agents can bargain with one another, and a market price for these externalities will actually emerge that will lead to an efficient provision of this commodity. So, imagine the case of mowing my yard. Here's a case where external benefits are actually produced. And unfortunately, because the private decision makers don't really account for those external benefits, yards are going to get mowed up to the point where private demand equals private supply, which is right here. Leads to deadweight loss in the economy equal to this gray shaded triangle right here. Now, my neighbors who are receiving an external benefit for every time that I mow my yard, they can't just walk into my yard in the middle of night and mow my yard for me, even though doing so would be socially beneficial. They can't do that because that would be a violation of my property rights. The property rights have been assigned to me. I own the property, which means that I can take care of my yard in a way that, in most cases, I see fit. There's an externality problem, right? I'm going to mow my yard up to the point where we reach QM, even though society would like me to mow my yard up to the point of QS. My neighbors can't just walk into my property and mow my yard for me. So how can we reach a socially optimal quantity? Well, one way that this can be done is if my neighbors just compensate me. Right? They offer me money to mow my yard those last couple extra times to kind of push me up from QM to QS. Well, that's going to basically take my private demand curve and push it up, because now I'm receiving additional benefits for mowing my yard. And it's going to push my private demand curve up. And if they pay me a payment equal to the external benefit that they receive, it's going to basically align my private demand curve with the social demand curve. And now, if I choose to mow my yard up to the point where my private benefit equals my private cost, it's now just going to happen to be the point where the new demand curve, this kind of zigzaggy demand curve, intersects my private supply curve, which is now going to be right here at QS. Rewarded for producing this positive externality. And that reward can be interpreted as an internalization of the external benefit that I produce. So now when I decide to mow my yard, beyond QM, now, what determines the price that my neighbors are actually going to be willing to pay me for every time that I mow my yard? Well, you can think of the market for an externality as having both a supply curve and a demand curve. The demand curve, which is the maximum price that my neighbors are willing to pay me to mow my yard, is just the external benefit they actually receive. Okay, so that's going to be a flat demand curve whose height is set equal to the external benefit that they receive. And the cost of mowing my yard is just going to be the cost that I incur, which is my supply curve. So the market price for an externality, payment that I'll receive, it's just equal to the external benefit that I actually generate. So this example here, where the payment that I receive is set equal to the external benefit that I produce, that isn't actually all that unrealistic if we can actually trade in that externality, right? They can pay me for this. On the cigarettes example, same kind of story. Remember, smoking cigarettes can be viewed as maybe creating some sort of negative externality, where the way that the Coase theorem would work here is that, well, every time that I create a negative externality, those who are being harmed, if they force me to compensate them for, the dry cleaning costs that they have to pay now because their clothes are smellier and smokier, or any adverse health effects, and medical costs that they're forced to pay. If they can somehow force me to compensate them for those costs that I'm imposing on them, then when I decide to smoke a pack of cigarettes, I'm not going to weigh just my previous private costs. I'm going to now factor in that compensation, as well, that I could pay, secondhand smokers, which effectively raises my private cost curve up to the social cost curve. And now when I decide to smoke, I'm going to be equating my private costs to the social cost, which is now really kind of my private cost. And I'll choose to smoke fewer cigarettes. What determines the compensation that I have to pay others? Well, my demand for this external benefit is just the benefit that I get for smoking. But the opportunity cost that society realizes for this external cost is just the value of that external cost, right? That's the cost that's imposed. A market for these costs could presumably be put into existence where some sort of equilibrium price, P star, prevails, which is just equal to the external cost itself. I'll buy and they'll sell these external costs up to the point where my benefits equal their costs on the margin, which is going to be P star. Which is going to be the value of the external cost itself. So it makes sense that the compensation that I'm going to have to pay people is just equal to the external cost itself. That's how this externality is going to be priced out in the marketplace. Now, if transactions costs are high, this might not work, because if I have to pay money to seek compensation, for instance, then the benefits of that compensation are going to be offset by legal fees, search costs, and I might not actually engage in this Coasean bargaining to begin with. In addition, if property rights are weak, figure out if someone's rights have been violated, even if it's clear that an external cost has been produced, then again, Coasian bargaining isn't going to work out so well. So Coasian bargaining really only works in a very, very limited number of cases where you have low transaction costs and you have very, very clearly defined and enforced property rights. So how can we actually solve this problem? Well, here's where government actually has a role. Okay, government can step in and intervene in the marketplace by imposing taxes and subsidies on buyers and sellers of commodities that basically force them to internalize the full cost and benefits of their decision. Or if the government wants to just completely, make sure that either nothing gets bought and sold or that it gets bought and sold at a very, very high level, some sort of command and control policy where government just kind of stipulates how much is going to be traded could be taxes and subsidies, oftentimes referred to as corrective taxes or corrective subsidies. Corrective taxes and corrective subsidies are very, very similar to the Coasian payments that one is either receiving or being forced to pay, although they're being imposed by the government. So, go back to our cigarette example, where there's some sort of external cost being generated. Well, again, the goal is to force that decision maker to realize the full social cost of her decisions. So what we could do is we could set a tax equal to the full external cost of smoking. And that tax, and we know this from previous lectures, is just going to raise the cost of smoking up to the point where it's equivalent to the social cost of smoking. And now, because this is the new private cost of smoking, when a private decision maker chooses to smoke cigarettes, she'll smoke up to the point where her private benefits are equal to her private costs, which are her pre-tax private costs plus the tax itself, and she'll choose to smoke right here, which is not only going to be the new market equilibrium, but it's also going to be the socially optimal quantity. Conversely, if we're talking about lawn mowing, where I'm producing extra benefits every time that I mow my yard, the government can actually try to get me to realize the full social benefits of my actions by paying me to mow my yard. Basically forcing my benefits to be aligned more closely with the full social benefits. And they can do that by offering me some sort of a subsidy. And doing that is going to raise my private benefit curve up so that it overlaps the social benefit curve. So now when I choose to mow my yard, I'm going to do so up to the point where my private benefit is equal to my private costs, which is now going to be at the socially optimal level. What got my private benefit up a little bit higher? Well, I'm being subsidized now. So now I'm being paid for every time that I mow my yard. Now, there could be a case where there is no efficient middle ground. It really makes sense to either have all or nothing.